Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming out for our annual town hall. We usually do around this time as we discuss budget. I'm not. Helps if I turn this on, huh? Test, test. There we go. Test, test. All right. I apologize about that technical difficulty. User error. It didn't hit the power. So thank you for coming out for our annual town hall. We usually try to time this right around our initial opening of our budget season, if you will. And then we also will try to have another one later on as we get closer towards completing the budgeting process. Some familiar faces that usually come out every year, so thank you for that, and some new ones. We also have some refreshments that we typically bring. Thank you, Tammy, for providing those. I know you didn't cook them, but the store did a good job. And if you are feeling so inclined to break your New Year's resolution and get sweets, it's all yours for the taking. So our Executive Director of Business Services, Tammy Fredrickson, will facilitate the conversation tonight. We have a presentation that we'll share, and then we'll open it up towards the end for questions and answers for the presentation as well. Some of you that dialed into the board meeting, we're at the board meeting on Monday. It's usually follows that. We kind of repeat that during our town hall, kind of synthesize some of that conversation for you as well. So again, thank you for coming out, and I'll turn it over to Executive Director Fredrickson.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Welcome, everyone. Some of this information, if you've attended these before, it may be repeat information, but I know we have a lot of new people that are interested in kind of our finance process. So if you'll bear with me, I'll go through some basic slides for you. The money that we get for our revenue comes from three basic sources. So the state of Minnesota, and that majority of it is the general fund formula. For next year, it's set in statute. It'll be $7,465 per pupil. That's the biggest portion that we get. There also are categorical aids that we receive, and those also in statute, formula-based, and they have to be used for very specific purposes. We can't use it for anything other than what's stated in the statute. And then we have partial reimbursement for our special education program. We also get local taxes, which are come in the form of the property taxes that you see on tax statements. And then we also have a voter-approved referendum that right now we currently have $624 per student. I think you all are aware that we asked for an increase to that, and the voters voted no on that, so we are currently still at $624 per student. And then we also get money from the federal government. Most of it flows through the state. So the state receives it, they'll pull out whatever administrative fees they want, send it to the districts, and then things like Every Student Succeeds Act, which is, you probably know what it is, Title I, or some of the title allocations. And then the Individuals with Disabilities Act is the federal dollars we get for special education. If we look at our state funding formula, which as I stated next year will be $7,465. This current year, it's $7,281. And if we look back to when they started doing this in 2003, if the funding formula and statute had kept up with our inflation rates, we would be receiving $8,645 per student, which is $1,364 per student difference. And if we take that multiplied by the number of students we have in the district, that's a difference of an additional $11 million that we could have seen in the district. The impact of enrollment is most of the money that we receive is based on enrollment. There are many funding formulas that specifically talk about enrollment. When we talk about enrollment, there's two different numbers that you'll hear kind of talked about. The enrollment is measured in average daily membership. So if a student is enrolled on the first day of school and the last day of school, they count as one average daily membership, or ADM. But for funding, the ADMs are weighted. So for voluntary pre-kindergarten, if a 1 ADM actually counts as a 0.6 pupil unit, and then students in kindergarten through grade 6 A 1 ADM counts as one pupil unit, and then all the students in grades 7 through 12, 1 ADM counts as a 1.2 pupil unit. So when you're calculating the formula, for instance, the $7,465 general fund formula allowance, the K through 6 would be $7,465 per student, but the 7 through 12, you multiply that by 1.2. Minnesota statute allows for open enrollment or school choice. Students have every opportunity to attend another district if they choose to do that. And if we look at our enrollment over the past 5 years, the first line in each of the years, that and teal colored, that's how many resident students we serve in our district. That rust colored bar is the number of students that choose to leave our district to open enroll in other districts. That green bar is the number of students from outside the district who enroll into our district. So that blue line is the net effect. So it's the green line minus the orange plus the green, or the teal color minus the orange plus the green equals that blue line. So you can see we've been benefiting from students choosing our district for at least the last 5 years. If we look at our projected enrollment moving forward, when we look at enrollment, we usually use, there's several different methods you can use. We choose to use a 3-year weighted average. So basically you look at the past 3 years of enrollment, you weight the current year with the most, and then you calculate the weighted average. I also want to make sure that you're looking at the grade progression. So for instance, in 2024, the first graders, the 581 first graders, next year will be second graders, so you just got to make sure that that age progression looks reasonable. And again, you can see that the projection for the next few years is that we have declining enrollment, which kind of corresponds to the declining birth rate in our district. When you're putting together a budget, the budget is kind of your planning tool to monitor all your revenues and expenses for the school year. It's based on projected revenues. You want to make sure that for a structurally balanced budget, that your expenditures don't exceed your revenues. But we do have ability for the board to approve use of fund balance, and our board fund balance policy is to maintain an unassigned minimum of at least 8%. So when we look at developing a budget, there is a state statute that says the budget has to be adopted by the school district prior to June 30th of the fiscal year. And because the revenues and expenditures aren't really totally known until the end of the year, there are many things that happen during the year that you may not anticipate. So there are final audit entries done at the end of the year. We have to use some assumptions. The first one that is pretty much a given is the formula allowance, which we know is going to be $7,465 per student next year. Then we also look at, this is a legislative funding year. We don't anticipate any additional revenue coming to the districts, but there is a possibility they could do something with the formula allowance, and if they do, we have to adjust our projections based on that. The staff salary that we have is based on our negotiated collective bargaining agreements. We have to make sure that we're following those agreements because we do have several unions in our district. We're assuming that the weather patterns are going to be the same. So if you look at how you budget for utilities, kind of look at the 5-year average. What did we spend over the last 5 years? And you're assuming 1 year was hot, 1 year was cold, 1 year we had snow, 1 year we didn't. So if you take that 5-year average, and then if you know what rates the utilities company is considering increasing it by, then you can kind of get an idea of what your utilities cost would be. We also assume that those student supports are going to be consistent in the previous year. So we don't want to see if there's more kids, we're going to have the same support staff. We have to just kind of take that into account. We also are going to assume that the categorical funding that we have is going to be used for the purposes that it was intended. Any of the revenue that we budget for the current year is intended to be used for the students that year. So any legislative changes we have to follow. So as the legislative session has been happening, we get updates daily on what's going on, what bills have been introduced, what potential impacts it may have on our revenues or expenses. We have to follow those and make adjustments accordingly. For the contracts and supplies, we're going to increase those by a reasonable inflation rate, unless we already know what the vendors are anticipating for an increase in the contract. We always work contracts kind of in the spring. Everybody's looking to finalize their contract for the next year. So a lot of them will know what the increases are. And then we're assuming that enrollment's going to be close to what we projected. So if any of those things don't happen, then we're going to have to possibly look at a revision on what our projection was. If we look at the last 5 years, this is, it's kind of hard to read, but this is our revenues and expenses that we've had for the last 5 years. It shows you the amount that we paid in property taxes and the percent that is, and then the additional state funding, federal funding, and then the Department of Education divides our expenditures into these categories: the administration, district support services, elementary, secondary education. Those we are required to report that way to the Department of Education. We don't have an option. So there are account codes that are associated with each of those. And you can see our percentages that we spend in each of those categories has been pretty consistent over the last 5 years. But we have been using fund balance to balance our budget, other than the year that we had COVID, when we had a significant amount of federal dollars come in and not as many expenses. So that 21, 22, you'll see we added to fund balance because of all that federal revenue. So what is the revenue? We have all the money that comes into the districts are a combination of state collected taxes, which are sales tax and income tax, and then locally collected property taxes. The general education aid is the largest kind of pot of that money. It's intended to fund the basic educational needs in every district. There's the categorical aid, that again is very specific on how you're allowed to spend those, and it is in statute. And then the property tax levies, December, the school board approves those property tax levies, and then there is a voter-approved referendum at whatever time you are required to have that go out to the vote. The categories are authorized in legislature, so again, they're very specific categories with very specific formulas. Some of those non-categorical, so when we say non-categorical, it means we're allowed to spend these dollars any way that the district feels is best supportive of our students. The basic general education formula kind of gives you the minimum level that school districts have. The extended time revenue, there are some students that will attend school over the summer or have longer days. We get extended time revenue for that. It's not a lot of money, but it is additional dollars. There's a declining enrollment formula that basically takes your general education formula times 28% times the number of students that you have, declining the number of fewer students. There's a pension adjustment revenue because the state has changed pension percentages. They give you some additional dollars to kind of compensate for those changed contribution rates. The transportation sparsity, it's based on the number of students that you have per square mile. Again, it's not a lot of money for us. The local optional revenue is a mix of aid and levy, and it has basically the same general uses that the general education formula allows. Equity revenue was intended to kind of help the disparity in revenue from those highest to lowest districts kind of in the area. The transition revenue, it pretty much saying that we're going to guarantee you're not going to get less money than you had in fiscal year 2015. And then, of course, the referendum money. So all of those, essentially you can put in that and call the non-categorical funding pot and use it for whatever you want. Some of that categorical revenue that we have Gifted and talented revenue, again, this is not a lot of money. It's $13 per pupil unit. So we get about 125,000. The basic skills or the compensatory revenue is how you usually hear it. It's based on the number of free and reduced lunch students. There's a list in statute of 12 things that you can use those dollars for. The state does have a report that's required. Last year, I think it was the first year that they required this. You have to show the state how you're spending those dollars to make sure that you're using it for one of those 7 categories. English learner revenue, obviously for our English learners. The operating capital has to be used for repair and maintenance of facilities, purchasing leased equipment, or purchasing textbooks. That's it. There's nothing else you can use that money for. Special education revenue, self-explanatory. It's using to educate and support our special education students. The American Indian education revenue, supporting our American Indian students. The QComp revenue was developed several years ago as a way to encourage districts to adopt an alternative structure for teachers, and you have to use it for professional development for teachers. The governor in his budget proposal this year is proposing to eliminate that revenue source. It may or may not make it through all the way through the final bill. If it does, in fact, get taken out, that's about $2 million for us. The long-term facilities maintenance, you have to use for deferred maintenance, health and safety capital projects, or increased accessibility to schools. You have to submit a 10-year plan to the Department of Education. The Commissioner of Education has to approve it after the school board approves it. You have to kind of adjust that every year. So while you have a 10-year plan, you have to update it every year. There's career and tech ed revenue, which obviously has to be used for our career and tech ed programs. Achievement and integration revenue is intended to improve the racial and economic integration, increase student achievement and reduce academic disparities. The literacy incentive aid, the calculation is actually based on how well students read in 3rd grade versus how much they've improved by 4th grade. It's a little over $1 million for us. The school library aid, again, self-explanatory. We have to use it to support our libraries in the schools. Non-public pupil revenue, we have to, it's kind of a flow-through money. It comes from the state. We have to send it to our non-public schools for those students. The student support revenue was fairly new. I think this is the 3rd year. That is used to support student personnel like counselors, social workers, school psychologists, chemical health dependency workers. So those, you have to use it for those dollars. The Safe School revenue, we use it to pay for our school resource officers, and then again, the referendum. So if we look at how much is categorical versus how much is just, are we allowed to spend? About 1/3 of the money that we get is categorical, which means we have very specific purposes that we can spend those dollars for. So if you look at the non-categorical revenue, which has to fund everything else, if you look at things like utilities, which we spend about $2 million a year, transportation, which we spend about $7 million, special ed, the cross subsidy, so we spend more than we get from aid for special education to support those students is about $5 million. There's a learning and development requirement that you have to spend $2 million supporting the teachers in kindergarten through 6th grade. The professional development, we have to spend 2% of our budget, which is about $2.5 million. So that's $18.5 million that we have to just take right off the top that we are required to spend for from our non-categorical. We have to pay our light bills and get the kids to school. So of that $80 million, 18.5 of it has to come right off the top for those items. So if we look at the state aid, these are all the categories of state aid that we get. There are several reports on the Department of Education website that you can go on. There's a levy certification report that shows the formulas. I've kind of summarized them all here. So when we look at our revenue projections, in all of these categories, we get about $97 million. If we look at the levy, again, that's approved in December by the school board. They're very specific categories with very specific formulas. This has already been approved in December because it's already out to the taxpayers. It's about $18 million. So what is our revenue projection for next year? If we look at our state aid, the levy, and then we also get other fundings like investment earnings, some grants, third-party billing, donations, other things that, other miscellaneous revenue that we get. It's about $5.7 million. So we're projecting our revenue for 25-26 to be $120.4 million. So what do we spend our money on? We have, for this current year, $122.8 million in our expense projection. 83% of that is supporting students. It's salary and wages, plus the materials that we send to the classrooms. 14% is spent on purchase services, so for transportation, utilities, and the other contracts that we have, software, and then 3% on capital expenditures. So the majority of what we spend money on is staff. We're very much tied to our people. If we look at the funding formula versus how much we spend per pupil, the state funding formula of $7,465 per pupil, they actually changed the legislation to tie that to inflation, but they put a cap of 3% on it. So in the future, unless they change the legislation in this session, we will never get more than an increase of 3%. This next year, they increased it by 2.5%. Then we spend about $13,000 to educate our students. And again, this is looking at the general fund expenses. And this is as of the 2023. They haven't updated the reports for 24 yet. And the state average is about $15,731 per student. Again, that's in the general fund. It's not taking into account the debt service, the food service, or the community ed funds. And while we try to spend our tax dollars very carefully, we honestly lack the funding that we need to address some of those priorities that have been identified as top priorities in our community. If we look at general fund expenditures, and this is taking out the capital funds, and those can't be used for anything other than capital. And this is just a comparison to some of the surrounding districts that we have. So we are spending less on per pupil than several of the other districts in our area. This is a 5-year forecast that we're projecting, and based on the enrollment projections that we saw before, the state aids and levies that we anticipate seeing, and then building in those increases. And you have 85% of your budget going to salaries, and you have collective bargaining agreements. Most of those collective bargaining agreements have salary increases already built into the agreements, so we have to pay those. So this is just showing if nothing changes, and I want to stress that this is just a forecast, it's not a future budget, it's just a forecast. If nothing changes, we are going to be taking a significant amount of money out of our fund balance. And you can see by 27-28, which by the way, our levy, our referendum expires in 27-28. So that's why in 28-29, you'll see the property taxes goes down by almost $6 million. That's assuming that our levy is, our referendum is going to expire. There is a statutory provision in legislature that our school board can increase that levy exactly as it is without voter approval, but it has to be exactly what it is now. So that would be $624 per student. But you can see we are going to be taking reductions out of our expenditures for the next several years. We are looking at $4 million coming out for the 25-26 and $4 million every year, at least for the next several years. So when we talked about the levy back in November before the vote, we had two different kind of sets of data that if the levy was approved, here's the things that we were hoping we could do based on the surveys from our community. And we were very clear that if it didn't get approved, these are the things that we were not going to be able to do anymore. I think these were out everywhere. They had them on our website. There was mailings. There was every community meeting we had. These were discussed at those meetings. So as we're looking for next year's budget, what are we going to have to do for next year to reduce our budget, our expenditures by $4 million? Those first three items, increase class size targets at elementary level by 2, the middle school cap on minimum class size, and some elective changes, and then also streamline electives and class sizes at the high school. Those were discussed at the board meeting in December, and because we had to start enrollment by the end of December, we needed a decision on if those were going to be kind of green light to go on, and the board did kind of give a thumbs up. So those have already been implemented. We've got those already in the enrollment projections and adjusting those as we move forward. The rest of these, we actually had a discussion at the board meeting on Monday night for these things. We're proposing some paraprofessional reductions in special education. Our director, Michelle Chuka, feels that she can make some adjustments within her staff and accommodate this, that if we need to look at some changes, she's more than willing to kind of fit those in her plans. We're moving the MinCaps program to the high school. We did find out that Farmington voted last night, Monday night, at their board meeting that they do not have the budget to continue the partnership with us. So they have pulled out of the MinCaps program, so we will just be serving our students, and we're going to be moving them over here, actually into DPOD. We've looked at the cost of how much it will take to move equipment and all of the program, and we feel like our facilities has reviewed all the space, and we think that will be a fit that we can manage. It'll reduce some of the transportation cost, and then by doing that, there are currently 4 assistant principals here at the high school. We would be reducing one of those. We talked about eliminating the online program. We don't have a lot of students in online, and we feel like we can accommodate those needs at our ALC over at Bridges. And then eliminating our 3rd grade SAGE program. We're talking about reducing iPads in elementary K-1, taking out the desktop computers for staff, and eliminating the EduClimber contract. Some of the other reductions that we're proposing is our QComp allocation. We exceed what we get for revenue, so we're proposing to reduce 2 peer coaches so that the revenue that we get doesn't it matches our expenditures. We're going to eliminate the fitness committee expenses. There's a fit committee that pays for some benefits that for all of the staff in the district, so we're going to eliminate those. And then because we voted, the board approved 2 less student contact days in the calendar for next year, that will save some transportation. The staff that don't have to work on those student release days, and the teachers on call sub rates will save 2 days of that. We're going to close the pool at Twin Oaks. That will save about $75,000. However, there is some very high maintenance costs that are anticipated needed at that pool. So those long-term facilities maintenance dollars will be moved to some other needs that we haven't been able to meet. And then we're going to do some adjustments to some of the administrative assistants, and that will be reducing 3 admin assistants throughout the district. There are a couple other things that we're talking about to optimize resources. It's kind of cost neutral. We currently have an employee assistance program that we're paying for. The Vector program software, it's kind of a training module where we have required training like blood pathogens and some safety and bicycle training. That was free for us. They have notified us that starting in July, it's no longer. So we're going to eliminate the Employee Assistance Program because now we have a similar program with Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is our new health provider, and just switch those so that we can pay for the Vector software. And then currently we have a couple building subs at our elementary sites that go between buildings when they're needed. By doing that, we end up having to pay for teachers on call subs. So we just thought we could just assign one building sub per building, and we would save those teacher on call cost. It would be kind of cost neutral. So those are the things that we presented to the board. I think that's it. Ran through those kind of quickly, but if there's questions, we will certainly entertain them.
Tammy, before we go to questions, if I may just give just a few more pieces of context. And one of the things that we're also looking at, I mean, there'll be some other reductions that our team is currently processing. The budgeting process is an iterative process. We will eventually come to the board with a preliminary budget in May, like kind of that almost final budget, and then in June, by the end of June, by statute, we have to present a final budget to the board for them to take action on. So we've got time to work through some of these other factors, and so we're continuing to review other reorganizing structures, curricular structures, things of that nature. So there will be additional reductions that we'll be bringing forward in conversations as we work through the process. Simultaneously, we are going into a legislative process. As you all probably are watching on the news, it's been quite the launch. We'll see what happens there eventually in terms of how they, figure out the rules of the sandbox. But I will say that many of the superintendents in the metro, I'll just say across the state of Minnesota, we're not alone in this situation. We're in a really structurally challenging space as a state. And the one thing that I would encourage many of you to become more active in as you can is at that state level advocacy. We have, as you saw, the base funding formula is predicated on a reality that's not really taking effect right now. We have stagnant enrollment at best. We have declining birth rates. The Minnesota demographer projected by the year 2030 we will have doubled the amount, more than double the amount of people 65 and older. So we're not getting as many babies as we typically have seen over the many years. So that funding formula is something that we want to continually press upon to ask the state to figure out what they can do about that. I would also say that another significant issue that many districts are facing is twofold. One, the continued cross subsidies of two primary areas, special education. Now, I want to be very clear, I appreciate our legislature taking action and funding us to the tune of about 45%. It comes woefully underfunded by the feds. The state historically has not done much of anything, but this past session they did put 45% into that formula, so that does help, while simultaneously our SPED referrals continue to go up across the state, across the country, quite frankly, as well. So at some point, that's going to be underwater again. And then another big cross subsidy happens to be English language learners, not fully funded from the feds, not fully funded at the state, and it's put upon the local communities by way of usually our taxpayers to say, help with this cross subsidy, okay? So those are two other areas that we want to be mindful of. And then lastly, there were a lot of mandates that came out of this last session. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. We are tracking about 60 plus mandates. There are a lot more. There's probably about 100 more mandates. Not every one of them come with huge unfunded or underfunded lines, but there are a couple that I want to just bring to your attention that from a community advocacy standpoint, it will be critically important for us as a community to bring our voices to the Capitol. And many of us and some of our board directors who are here this evening, we belong to advocacy groups, the Minnesota School Boards Association, the Association of Metro School Districts, and Michelle Chuka belongs to MACE, which is our special education. Emily belongs to our food service advocacy group. So a lot of our administrative group, we belong to these advocacy organizations that really try to bring our voices to the Capitol to advocate for change. I'm just a superintendent. Oftentimes I can be a talking head with legislature, with the legislature. As parents, your voice carries weight. And so as we go into this session, my ask of our collective community, if there's nothing else, is to ask for no new mandates and revise or repeal the mandates that came under or unfunded from the last session. We are looking at things that are costing us in the neighborhood of about $1 million to $1.5 million. It's even higher if we can't continue to do the READ training through our teachers' contracted day. Just to put that into perspective, you saw our calendar has been aligned so that we had, well, this year we have early release. Listening to some of the feedback from our families, if there's a way that we could streamline that and not have it spread throughout the year, and just it's easier to program from a family standpoint in one full day release versus multiple half day releases, etc. So next year we'll be doing a 2-day, kind of combining them all into 2 full days in the first semester and second semester. That allows us to bring all of our professional development that's statutorily required for READ Act into the teacher's contract day. If we weren't able to have a calendar like that, and we don't know what will happen with successive requirements with READ Act, we would be on the hook for about $1 million to cross-subsidize the funding that we didn't receive from the state of Minnesota to pay our teachers for professional development. Okay? Now again, we're one of a few lucky districts, and I'm thankful, appreciative of our board and our community, and I understand that's a sacrifice from a family standpoint to not have that day, but we also have requirements to meet to train our teachers in the science of reading and a variety of other things as well. We have earned, safe, and sick time. We have summer unemployment mandates. That is covered through 2026, and it's highly projected it's going to be done in 2026, and then we'll be on the hook for that state mandate. And one of our colleagues in education, when we were many of us were testifying a couple weeks ago, and the challenge that we are pushing to our legislature is that you're bringing in all these mandates, and if we're going to be on like a report card to say how are we doing, if it's about earned, safe, and sick time, 100% of people who apply for that and qualify for that, we're going to deliver on that. And statutorily, we have to pay it A+. Summer unemployment, anybody who applies for that, we have to deliver on that and give that to them, A+. Universal meals, leaving no kid unfed, we got $200 million in K-12 education, A+. But when it comes to the things that actually matter, that our communities will say, are you educating our kids? Unfunded. Okay? So this is the challenge that we're in right now. So your collective voices will really help our community to ensure that as we go into this session, that we are able to bring our story, our reality, our perspectives to help influence the legislative changes that need to be made so that we don't find ourselves continually behind the 8 ball. So just want to give that some context as well as we go into that. So open it up for some questions that you might have around our budgeting process. Yes.